Hello and welcome to Sri Lanka 99.94 Cricket Every Day. My name is Mark Machado and I'm joined as always by Estelle Devon from the Papare. And today we're discussing the life, times and career of Bhanuka Rajapaksa. This is Sri Lanka 99.94, your home of Sri Lanka content, and we'll be dropping into your podcast feed and on YouTube or the 99.4 app several times a week. So please do, if you listen, rate, review, subscribe, tell a friend, and also you can contact us on Twitter and give us any feedback you want. I'm thick-skinned, so feel free to troll me. Don't say any naughty things or bad things to Estelle. By the way, she's got too much going on and doesn't need to listen to your vitriol. But I kind of enjoy it. Right, Estelle, we're talking about Bhanuka Rajapaksa today. In the last 12 months, he's become a pivotal figure for Sri Lanka's T20 hopes. But let's start right at the beginning of his career because he came through Royal College and was a very highly rated player as a youngster, right?
Yeah, he was. I think he caught everybody's attention during the 2010 Under-19 World Cup. It was in New Zealand, I believe, and Sri Lanka had a pretty decent side. Kusal Janith Pereira also was in that team. Bhanuka really, I think, exploded in that tournament. And just before that, he got 100 in Australia, I think, just before the tournament. And more than the number of runs, I think he finished in the top 5 run scorers. And he was the top scorer for Sri Lanka. More than the amount of runs he got, I think everyone was impressed with his style of play. I think one thing that really sticks with everyone who you ask about Bhanuka Rajapaksa was the fact that Wasim Akram really rated him highly at that point. I believe he compared him to Aravinda De Silva. So there were a lot of hopes surrounding Bhanuka at that point of time, just when he was starting off as like an adult cricketer.
It's also worth having a chat about schoolboy cricket in Sri Lanka as well, which we talk about quite a lot on this show. Royal College, the school where Bhanuka went, is one of the big Colombo schools. There's several big schools across the island. Well, I say across the island, mainly in Colombo and Kandy, and some slightly kind of, I say smaller, I mean small in terms of reputation, schools outside of Kandy and Colombo. Royal College is pretty much one of the biggest two schools in Sri Lanka. Definitely have the biggest, what's called the big match, right? And if you come through Royal College and are scoring lots of runs, and I think at one point he was a bowler as well at school, right? And potentially taking wickets and are, a talisman of the team. There's a lot of pressure on you, and on top of all that, you kind of get like very quickly and quite young. You grow a reputation around the kind of Sri Lankan domestic cricket watching public, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that a lot of Sri Lankan players experience. Even the likes of Niroshan Dickwella coming out of that school's arena had a very big reputation. So Bhanuka was no different. And he was fortunate enough to have featured, I think, in a Under-19 World Cup, which Sri Lanka did well in. Sri Lanka finished 4th. They lost to eventual champions Australia in the semis. So all round that team was good, and he was the star of that team. So he had a lot of eyes on him, particularly after those like comparisons to Aravinda and just the way he batted, the way he was able to time the ball. Not really different to what we see from him right now, right? His shots are very similar. Those flicks on the leg side, he's slicing the ball square of the wicket on the offside. So he had a lot of attention on him, and like you said, the whole big match culture and that school's culture, very early in players' lives, it gives you that kind of pressure, right? I don't know if you see that kind of thing in other countries where at a school's game you've got thousands and thousands of people watching. And I mean, you star in one of those big matches, I'm telling you, everywhere you go for the rest of your life, people are going to talk about it.
Yeah,
And I know this by experience, seeing guys who I work with who have performed well for their respective schools at those big matches, the rest of your life, people are going to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So my father and all the men in the Sri Lanka side of my family all went to St. Peter's College, and their big rivalry is St. Joseph's. And my dad, who's in his 60s, he hasn't been in the last few years because of COVID, but him and his classmates still meet up around the world in Colombo for the big match and go to the games. Not every year. He's not wealthy enough to do that, but every few years when they can, they arrange these big reunions. And the people who were stars in his kind of era, in the back end of the 70s and into the early 80s, are still, when they walk around Colombo now, they still get stopped and people talk to them about stuff they've done in the big match, and they kind of live off that, for the rest of their life. And it can have positives and it can have negatives in their players, in the way that these people's lives go on to develop for the, because obviously you can't really judge what, your whole life and what you've done when you're 19. But I think the one thing it does do is it does set players up for playing on much bigger stages, right? Whenever a young Sri Lanka or development side or a youth team comes over to England, I'll try and go and watch them. And I always sit there thinking, this must be so weird for the boys, because the boys must be all thinking, I'm going to play England in Surrey or Essex, or wherever they're playing. This is the biggest moment of my life. When actually there's about 30 people watching them, most of which are the players' relatives. And there's no Papare band. There's no big media presence. There isn't the Papare streaming it live. There's almost no journalists there covering it. It must be so weird to go from playing these huge big matches in international stadium filled with thousands of people to playing in front of a few men and their dogs. But anyway, it does set players up to go and play on much bigger stages. And you mentioned there, I'm not sure if there's another sporting culture like it. Incidentally, on South Africa 99.94, they did an episode about schoolboy cricket in South Africa and how it prepares players. And a man has compared schoolboy cricket in South Africa to that of Sri Lanka, which I thought was an interesting comparison, and something I'm glad that got a mention. Let's talk about what happened after he became a schoolboy, right? Because when he's in the early part of his career, we're talking the early part of the last decade, so 2011 onwards, that's kind of Sri Lanka's peak in terms of being a cricketing superpower. And it's very unlikely a young player, 19, 20, 21, 22, is even going to break into the side, right? Because that's a Sri Lanka team that is getting to finals, winning the T20 World Cup in 2014. And there's some players who are legends of the game set into their batting lineup. So he has to go make a way for himself in Sri Lanka domestic cricket. But that's also a time when the domestic game in Sri Lanka is almost getting cannibalized by the proliferation of first-class teams, right?
Yeah, that era was, I would say, kind of impossible for a player of his age to break into, because like you mentioned, 2009 T20 World Cup finalists, 2010 semi-finalists, I think, 12 again finalists, 14 champions. So it was really tough. I'm sure he's not the only player who missed out during that period, because there were a lot of players a bit older than him who had prolific records in domestic cricket but just could not break into that side. So yeah, unlucky, but I mean, you can't blame anybody for it, because Sri Lanka was getting the results, right? So there was almost like no need to try new things and try getting in new players.
We'll take a short break there. When we come back, we'll talk. I want to talk a little bit more about what Estelle just said there and about breaking into the team. And we'll talk about the rest of Bhanuka's career.
You're listening to Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. Whatever your team, we have the show for you on podcast, YouTube, or on the 99.94 app. We have India, England, South Africa, West Indies, and now Sri Lanka covered. If you want to find us, the best way is to follow us on social media at 9994DM by downloading the 9994 app or Google 99.94 on podcast. We speak cricket.
So Estelle, you talked about how he was unlucky to not break into the side at that stage. In Sri Lanka, we have a culture in the cricket team of bringing players in quite young and almost letting them kind of hang around the squad and maybe play when they're 19, 20, 21. We've seen that over the years. We've seen that most recently with Walala Gay, and we saw it a few years ago at Avishka Fernando as well. Is that really a strategy? Is that really a strategy at all? And does it really work? Because surely the pathway's got to be that you go from playing schoolboy cricket, under 19 international cricket, to then playing kind of against other domestic professionals. And then from there, if you make enough of a reputation for yourself, and when a space in the team appears, then you step into it, opposed to the kind of structure that I say structure, the strategy that we have now, where we pick players young and go, we think these are the future players, let's get them in and around the team. Because for every one player that's kind of come through that way, I can think of several others whose games haven't really developed, and actually putting them in early on has stifled their career because either they've got scared away, they've found the step up too big and we don't see them for a few years, or for whatever reason their development is stifled. If you look about the other players that immediately become the senior players when the class of, I'm going to say class of 2011, or you could say class of 2014, start to wind their careers down and retire, then those are the players that have been around for quite a long time, but don't step into that position straight away. And I know it sounds like I'm blaming the players. Obviously, to some degree, they're the ones that lose their wicket or, don't take wickets, whatever. But you have to look at the structure underneath it as well, right? And maybe incubating Bhanuka Rajapaksa and not having him being involved in the side till 2019 might, in a way, have been the making of him, possibly.
Yeah, I guess it all comes down to character, right? I think someone like Dinesh Chandimal, Tisara Pereira all came through around the same time. They are maybe a couple of years older to Bhanuka Rajapaksa. So it's a bit of a hit and miss. Like, if you really look at someone like Dinesh Chandimal, has he fulfilled his potential despite, at least in limited overs cricket? Because he was known to be a dasher at Ananda College. But has he really been able to fulfill that? I don't know. I don't know which side of the fence I'm on this one, because we've had players who have come in and who've had a lot of success. Someone like Dunit Vellalage, for example. I wasn't expecting him to do as well as he did, if I'm being completely honest. But he seemed to have that character to kind of step up to that big stage against one of the top teams in the world and put in some really good performances. He seemed to have that kind of, it's character, isn't it? Like the attitude, the perspective you bring to the game. So Bhanuka Rajapaksa, I'm not really sure. You never know, right? It's something that obviously didn't happen at that period of his career. But I do think for some players, like say, we saw someone like Michael Hussey debut at 30 and then build an incredible record, right? So maybe for Bhanuka Rajapaksa also, that whole period of the better part of his 20s he spent, toiling in domestic cricket, has made him the player he is today.
I'd love to deep dive Chandimal and Tisara Pereira's career with you one day. I think Chandimal's career is quite interesting, and Tisara Pereira, I think he's probably the most misunderstood player in Sri Lankan cricket history, possibly. So Bhanuka Rajapaksa ends up making his debut in 2019 on that tour of Pakistan, which happens before Does it happen before the World Cup in 2019, or is it? Hold on. No, it's afterwards. It's after the 2019 World Cup. We need to talk about the 2019 World Cup, because that was, I suppose, in many ways, the kind of last chance for that post 2015 generation to kind of come down and claim to try and do something and nail their shirts down, as it were. When you look back in that squad, it feels there's so many kind of players who are now the older players, even though it was only like 3 years ago, who you think probably aren't going to play ever white ball cricket. You look at Dimmoth's in that squad, Thirmane's in that squad. They're two players where you just feel that the white ball game's kind of left them behind a little bit. But that was a discussion we were having going into the 2019 World Cup. So afterwards, for that tour of Pakistan, it's almost like a total reset, right? And you look at the teams that was being fielded, and it's kind of an early prototype of the team that we expect to take the field during the T20 World Cup in Australia that's coming up in a few days' time now. Dasun Shanaka was captain. Hasaranga was that's where he kind of started to make a name for himself. Gunatilaka, I think, opens the batting, and Bhanuka Rajapaksa comes into the T20 side, and he makes a lot of runs very quickly, right?
Yeah, that I think more than them Sri Lanka cricket trying to kind of restart this new thing, it was that a lot of players were a bit reluctant to travel to Pakistan, of course, after the incident which Sri Lanka had to face a few years earlier. So that turned out almost like a blessing in disguise for someone like Bhanuka and even Dasun Shanaka. That was his first captaincy opportunity. And I know a lot of our fans or people who listen to the podcast are a bit disappointed we didn't mention it when we did speak about Dasun Shanaka. But that series definitely was a big stepping stone for the players that you mentioned, and in particular Dasun Shanaka and Bhanuka Rajapaksa, because for Rajapaksa, I felt it gave him something to fall back on when his ability was questioned, right? When eventually his, record was questioned or whatever, he could fall back on the fact that he's performed in those 3 games. I think the runs he made, it's not just the number of runs, it's the way it's made. He batted at number 3 and just kind of blew away the Pakistani attack at home. So that was really important for him in that sense as well, because not only did he get runs, but he kind of, the way he got it showed Sri Lanka like that this guy who you were talking about a decade ago, he's still here and he's still as good. He hasn't, maybe we haven't made best use of him in the past 10 years, but he's still capable of performing the way, or the potential we saw in him is still there.
Yeah, and at that point, he's what, 27, 28? I mean, he's not old at all. I feel like every episode I have to come on and say 27 is not old. But it's strange, right? Because in most other parts of the world, making your debut at 27, 28 is perfectly kind of normal and acceptable. In Sri Lanka, it feels like he's a journeyman player at that point, and he's not really. He's just, for various different reasons, they've gone in different directions. There's absolutely no reason why making your debut that age is in any which way a kind of slur on your ability. It's not at all, isn't it? And players develop at different times, and you've got to take your, different opportunities occur at different moments in people's lives, right?
Yeah, I think what happened with Bhanuka was that maybe that 2010 World Cup was the first time that there was so much hype around the Under-19 World Cup, where matches were telecast live and people got to see these players. And then you have people like Itruan Vitanage, Kusal Janit Pereira, who had made the jump to the international arena. Kusal Janit Pereira played the 2014 World Cup, right? So, what did he? Yeah, he was in that squad, right? So, the fact that the star of that side, that 2010 side, was nowhere near the national setup in the next 10 years, I think that's what kind of got people talking. Like, where has he been? And if you look at his record, statistically, it's not a great record, right? It's not an outstanding record. It's decent. But that's what got people talking. Like, where have you been hiding Bhanuka Rajapaksa? Because Sri Lanka doesn't have batters like that, right? Who can come from the word go, can go after the ball. Sri Lanka doesn't have those type of batters.
And he stays in the team essentially up till COVID. I mean, from the point of making his debut till COVID, it's only about 6 months anyway. And then when cricket restarts in Sri Lanka under Mickey Arthur, there's the whole fitness debacle. Right, we've now talked about fitness and Sri Lankan players' fitness and skin fold tests, but this has been a common theme for the last since the restart, right? Where SLC have brought in standards. We now know, I think they've relaxed some of the standards. I think, was it 2 kilometers or 2 miles they had to run in under 8 minutes?
2 kilometers.
2 kilometers. Which I'll admit I can't do right now. But if I was being paid to play sport, I reckon I'd be able to do it within about 3 or 4 weeks. And they get skin fold tests. I'm a prop and I play rugby union, so I will never pass that. But I think it's entirely, personally, and there's many different takes on this, and I'm not saying my take is right, but I think SLC are entirely in their right. And I'm not often that I support them. In fact, mostly we've spent the last few episodes of this calling them out for not doing enough for domestic cricket or women's cricket. But I think they are right to have those fitness tests. And I think a big part of the improvement of performance that we've seen from Sri Lanka the last 18 months has come from players being more professional when they're not on the field. And we've talked endlessly about the fielding and how big a part the fielding played in winning the Asia Cup. And I think a lot of that has come from driving up professional standards, and that the way you can most directly do that with sports people is by testing fitness, right? Bhanuka Rajapaksa struggled a bit trying to get fit, though. I think that's fair to say, right?
Yeah, I think he's probably had issues with fitness right throughout his career. But I agree with you on the whole fitness issue. I feel like it could have been handled better by both parties. But yeah, Sri Lanka really needed to buy it. The team needed to buy into that ethos of professionalism, right? And I feel like with Rajapaksa, what happened was the fitness was an issue, but he was also really frustrated with the communication between SLC and himself, where actually the example he gave was that he was told he's going to the Caribbean, and then just before the team left, he was told he's not going. And then, things kind of snowballed from there. So fitness tests were, I think, essential. And we spoke about this on a previous episode as well with regards to the women's team, where there are so few things that you can control, right, on the cricket field. And fitness is one thing that's in your hands to kind of improve and get on top of. And that the results of that kind of strict enforcement of those standards, the results of those are what we are seeing now with the fielding and even running between the wickets and things like that. I'm sure Bhanuka Rajapaksa is not the fittest player on that side, but you have to say that his performances have improved. They have improved as a result of getting fitter. So it's benefited him in the end. I think most of all, it was a lot of things that they should have spoken to each other or spoken behind closed doors that came out in the media. And then, the media likes to roll with stuff like this. So kind of blew it out of proportion. But I know that at least on the face of things, Mickey and Bhanuka kind of made up, and Bhanuka understands that Mickey Arthur was just trying to get the best out of a player who everyone knows has so much potential, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because around the time I remember, and I think this was either just before they were going to, or during, or just after when Sri Lanka were in England last year, I saw Bhanuka Rajapaksa had posted quite a feisty comment on his Facebook page about being left out of the squad, right? And when I read it, my initial reaction is, this to me doesn't sound like a team player at all. And this to me sounds like somebody who's got a point to prove. And I was a bit like, I'm not sure I want this kind of energy back into the team. Part of that, I think, was probably because I hadn't seen much of him talk. I hadn't seen much of him, he's not, he talks openly about not being a fan of not saying he's not a fan of social media, but he doesn't post a lot. He's not, he's not very active with his Instagram page and stuff like that. But he gets back into the side partly because of that Durham debacle, right? We talk so much about Durham on this podcast. It's the Durham incident. It's quite extraordinary. These huge turning points, and we never knew that at the time, and especially after when you heard the punishments, how big a moment that would end up being for Sri Lanka cricket. But he gets back into the side, and he has quite an extraordinary World Cup, right? And that paves the way for him to get called, to get sold in the IPL. And now, suddenly, he after scoring a massive knock in the Asia Cup final, people are talking about him as one of Sri Lanka's star players.
Yeah, and you forgot about the 10-day retirement.
I think I totally forgot about that.
Yeah, so I mean, that retirement came out of the blue, but again, it had something to do with fitness, I think. But he said it was family obligations. Thankfully, the retirement lasted only 10 days. So I think every Sri Lankan who watched the Asia Cup is happy that whoever managed to change his mind was successful.
Can we talk about the retirement a little bit more? Hold on, let's take another break and then get into the retirement chat.
If you love the language of cricket and want more, then head over to the 99.94 app and you can hear all of our podcasts and cricket commentary. We're adding new shows all the time and covering cricket series from all over the world. Be the first to hear all of our announcements by following us on social media at 9994DM. Welcome to Cricket's Conversation.
So it looked Sri Lanka were going to where did they go? Was it India?
I think it was India.
Is it when the India Test squad was announced? I think it was India, and for whatever reason, Bhanuka Rajapaksa wasn't picked, and within a few hours of that squad coming out, he announced his international retirement. I immediately thought the worst had happened and that he was going to imminently declare that he was moved to Sri Lanka to play minor league, then major league cricket, which is also available on 99.94. And I thought that was it. We'd lost him. And then a kind of mini teledrama unfolded where after kind of social media revolt, don't forget you have the power, just say it on social media. A turn of events unfolded that could have been foreseen if you follow Sri Lankan cricket, but will be extraordinary to anyone who doesn't, where he basically got called up by the sports minister, who at the time was at Namal Rajapaksa, right? No relation, I should add. And that's if you understand what's going on in Sri Lanka politically, it's very important to understand that Bhanuka is not related to any of the political Rajapaksa family. And then they kind of talked him out of retiring, right? I mean, I don't want to go into the how the Rajapaksa political family might rule Sri Lanka and some of their tactics that they might use to persuade a cricketer to unretire. But whatever happened, he was unretired within a 10-day period, and he gets picked up soon after that in the IPL, right? So what was your take when all this was happening, Estelle?
Yeah, so we kind of heard a rumor at the papare.com that this might be coming. It was almost immediately after the new kind of more stringent fitness benchmarks were announced. So the 2 km run, I think they reduced the time, and then the skin folds as well got a bit tighter. And almost immediately afterwards, he announced his retirement, saying that it's due to family obligations. And I think he had recently gotten married and kind of gave that as a reason. But of course, everybody knew that that wasn't the case. And I was really disappointed because I felt like, see, he captained the Gaul Gladiators as well in the LPL. I felt, look, this guy, he kind of has some leadership qualities in him, right? He's a mature guy. He's, first of all, he's not a guy who gets into the team just because he's, or if he was captain, just because he's captain. He gets there on skill, and he seemed to be someone who could kind of be in that, not even if he wasn't captain, in that kind of leadership group. So it was disappointing, I think, at that point to hear that he would give up so easily without, just because of a fitness issue, where it felt like there could have been something worked out. But yeah, within 10 days, he was called up by the sports minister, and he came back saying that he wants to withdraw his letter of resignation because he felt like he had more to offer. I think that was the overriding theme throughout. The minister also spoke about it. Sanat, I think Lasit Malinga also spoke about the fact that Bhanuka Rajapaksa has so much to offer Sri Lanka cricket, because, like I mentioned before, right, you don't get batters like him in Sri Lanka very often. So, I mean, there have been others also who have come forward in the most recent past saying that they convinced him not to go. And he was, I think there was a kind of a deal, or there were discussions going on with USA, someone in the US, uh, about getting him on board. But yeah, thankfully, none of that worked out, and he's here playing for Sri Lanka. And the fitness standards, seemingly, those issues have gone away as well. So yeah, good that he's. I'm really glad whatever happened within those 10 days happened.
I'm sure at some point somebody write a book or at least a long read and some cricket publication about those 10 days. Let's talk about his franchise career. He did play a bit of in Bangladesh early on in his career in their franchise leagues. He played for the Punjab Kings in the IPL, the last iteration of the IPL. I thought he did really well. They dropped him when Johnny Bairstow arrived, which was, I think, 3 or 4 games in. And then there was basically a clamour to bring him back because Johnny Bairstow wasn't in the form, wasn't in particularly great form. And Bhanuka was scoring well ahead of the, his strike rate was good. So he ended up finishing the tournament in the starting 11, which I'll be honest with, I thought was a bit, I wasn't expecting that to begin with. I thought if he gets a game because somebody else is injured, he actually looked quite at home playing IPL cricket. He didn't look out, he wasn't off the pace at all. We've seen that has obviously improved his game internationally because, for all the love for Sri Lankan cricket you can have in the world, the money that kicks about the IPL just means that it's just better coaches, better quality players you're playing against, better everything. It's like what I used to think of America when I was a kid. Just thought everything was better over there. But in cricketing terms, that's the IPL, right? Everything is just better in the IPL. He's going off to play a lot more franchise cricket as well, isn't he? He's got bought by various other franchises in the future.
Yeah, and those deals I think aren't going away anytime soon. He's one of those players who is so valuable in current T20 cricket, right? And I think that one of the reasons for his success in the IPL was the role he was given. It was well defined. He knew exactly what he needed to do. For Sri Lanka, if I'm not mistaken, he played most of his cricket in the top 3. So having to adjust to that number 5 position took him a bit of time. But what we saw in the Asia Cup, that's the kind of destruction he can wreak, right, for that side in the middle order. And that's exactly the type of thing that Sri Lanka have been missing for so many years. Even if you look at the 2014 team or the 2012 team or 2009 team, you didn't really, apart from Thisara Pereira, like you mentioned, you didn't really have that kind of player in the middle order. And Thisara Pereira was more of, how can I say this politely? He was more bowling all-rounder in those times, who was expected to kind of bat 2-3 overs and get a couple of sixes, right? But Rajapaksa's role is a lot different. He has much more responsibility coming in at number 5. And he's really made that position his own, and he's almost indispensable, isn't he, going into this World Cup in particular? Because Sri Lanka don't have another player like him who can go after the bowling right from the word go, and who can time the ball as well as him.
Yeah, me and you talk about Sri Lankan cricket at least 3 times a week in 99.94. And the one thing we always say is, what will happen if Rajapaksa gets injured, right? Because he's the one player where there doesn't appear to be a natural replacement. There's other players who you'd be absolutely devastated if they got injured, but he's the one that doesn't have a light-for-light replacement. I mean, me and you were both contemplating Danushka maybe taking his place as the big hitter, but I don't know if he would bat so low down. He's a big hitting opening batter. Of course, the other 2 people, someone we've already mentioned, would be Kusal Pereira, or, well, I was going to say Avishka Fernando. I mean, Avishka Fernando would be in the team, but he's a totally different batter. He bats totally with a totally different style. So, yeah, it's quite a big hole that would need to be filled. And hopefully he's going to go to World Cup and score lots of runs. Estelle, before we wrap this up, though, I want to talk about Bhanuka as a person, because I've watched a very long interview, which, wasn't long enough, in my opinion. He did with, is it Danu? Date with Danu, that he did with his wife. And there's a few other bits on social media, on YouTube and stuff, that you can find of Bhanuka Rajapaksa. Firstly, he speaks English brilliantly. Secondly, the other thing I've learned is that he's a big fan of dogs, right? I think has he got 10 dogs?
He's got a lot of dogs. I don't know how many. And I think one of the things he had said before he kind of broke into the IPL and all was that he wants to make money and have this dog sanctuary and take care of street animals. So that's another reason to want him to succeed in international cricket.
Yeah, exactly. And when he was with his on in that show, Date with Danny, with his wife, they come across as quite a cute couple as well. So I really wish and hope for all the best for Bhanuka and his wife and his dogs. And I hope he can one day score the runs keep scoring the runs that keep us winning, and one day win a global tournament, not just a continental tournament for SL.
Not one day, in a month's time.
No pressure, Bhanuka, no pressure. What I was trying to do there, Estelle, is show that, it's not all about the next month. There'll be times after. But with SLC, who knows? Thank you for listening to Sri Lanka on 99.94 Cricket every day. Please rate, review, and subscribe. Download the 99.94 app. Follow us on Twitter at Mark Machado, or Estelle at Estelle_Vasude1, as in the number 1. We put links for everything we do there on this podcast and beyond. Also, follow our network at 99.94DM on social media. Follow for podcast and commentary from the bat and ball world. Thank you for joining Cricket's Conversation on 99.94. We speak cricket.